everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Nader. In this video, we're going to go over the ternary operator in JavaScript. This is also another bit of syntax that allows us to kind of write a more short form version of something that we already know how to do. So if you already are comfortable with conditional statements like if, and else statements, the ternary operator is definitely a nice tool to add to your tool belt. Definitely not absolutely necessary to know in order to make your code work. However, it definitely makes the code a bit more concise and easier to read in certain scenarios. So I'm excited to go through ternary together. Let's get right into it. Okay, so I have a few slides set up for this and we'll go through some code examples as well. So this first one, I just want to show you what happens when we have kind of an if, an else statement versus a ternary. Okay, so let's focus on the left over here real quick to start. You can see that I have a variable and it's called happy and pointing it at true. Okay. And over here, we have an if-else statement that is basically checking to see if happy is true, we're going to do one thing, otherwise we're going to do something else, right? So a very simple if-else statement. Now, if happy is true, what we want to do is we want to console.logout yay. Otherwise, in the case that it's kind of falsy or not true in this case, we want to log out nope. Okay, very, very simple bit of code right here. So hopefully that code makes sense. Now, the ternary operator allows us to basically take this code and kind of like simplify it using some new bits of syntax. So I've kind of highlighted the corollary for kind of where the if goes and then where the else goes using the colors here. But let's go through it together real quick before we actually code this out. So same thing here, we have happy being true, but the part that changes is kind of this part right here. So this is the shortened syntax for the if else statement. What we do at the start is we have the expression that we want to evaluate. Now over here, I actually got rid of the curly, or not curly brackets, the regular kind of parentheses that you see over here with the if statement. Technically speaking, they are not necessary. However, it is kind of good practice to involve it. I just want to show you kind of a few ways to do it. But here we're asking the same question. The way to read this is effectively the same way you'd read an if-else statement, kind of top to bottom. Okay, so we're going to ask the question, is happy true? Okay, and the question mark is going to dictate what happens in the case that this statement is truthy or passes. Okay, and in this case, what we're saying is we're going to console.logout yay, just like we had over here, right? And then in the falsy case, for the else, we're going to use the colon, right? And the colon is going to show that we want to console.logout nope. So on the right-hand side of the question mark, we have an expression. Do note that there's no semicolon at the end of this. And I'll show you in a future slide what happens if we do that. Then after the colon, we have another expression, but we can put a semicolon at the end because that's the end of this entire expression. So technically speaking, this entire thing that I've highlighted right here is kind of one line of code or one singular block of code that goes together. Okay, so from start to finish, just like we'd put a semicolon at the end of the line, we would put a semicolon at the end of this entire statement after the colon area. And we're doing the statement after the colon. Okay, so is happy true? If it is, do this thing with the question mark after. Otherwise, do this thing with the colon after. Okay, so before we go into the code, I just want to mention that a lot of people really don't like this syntax or get confused by it. And I'm a bit on the fence about where to actually really use this. I think in a simple scenario, and I'll go through this more as we end up writing more complicated versions of this together. This is really, really nice to use and actually provides really, really simple, concise syntax when we use it in certain cases. However, in other cases, it might be more complicated than it's worth, and we'll go through a couple of those as well. So in this case, since we only have one thing happening, and it's a very simple thing, both for the yes case and as well as the no case, I would say that this syntax probably is preferable to this syntax most of the time. So let's actually code this out and see what happens. So I'm going to pull up Visual Studio Code. I'll just do intro.js here. And what I'll say is I'll just create a const happy here, and I'll set it to be true, just to keep it really simple and consistent with the slides so we can get through this together. So the way that we want to do this is we want to say the statement first, right? So we want to say is happy exactly equal to true. So normally when you would write this, for example, in English, you might say like a question mark, like is happy equal to true, right? And then if it is true, if you are happy, then you will want to do something, right? So you can kind of think of it the same way, right? That's kind of where these operator syntax actually came from. So if happy is true, we want to console.log out. Well, I think we went with yay in the slide there, so we'll go with that. Okay. Now, if I just save this and I try to do like a semicolon at the end of this, let's actually see what ends up happening. I'm gonna pull up my terminal, make sure I'm in the right folder. I'm gonna run node, and this is intro.js, and boom, right? Explosion of errors on our screen. So the error here is that we get a syntax error saying unexpected token semicolon, right? And that's because we absolutely have to have the entire expression for a ternary. It's called a ternary as opposed to binary or a unary because it has 3 parts. Okay, it has the question, it has the thing that happens if that is true, and then it has the thing that happens if it's false, which we're going to code in a second. So it has 3 distinct areas, ternary. Binary means 2, and unary just means 1. So we can't kind of ignore the third part because then it's not really a ternary, right? So here we can put a colon, and then we can do the third part, which is the false part. So then I can say console.log out, and I think I had nope, right? And then if I put a semicolon at the end of this, now if I try to rerun this code, what we'll see is that we actually get yay printed out, right? So what is happening in JavaScript here is we have true. We're asking is true equal to true, and it is, of course. So we're actually going to go into the yes case, which is this, and we're going to ignore the no case, which is this. Okay. So if I do false and I rerun this code, what we'll see is that we actually say is false equal to true. We're going to ask that. This is going to skip this stage because it's false. So we're actually going to go to what comes after the colon, which is nope. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, again, just to really reiterate, I think you can now hopefully see if I put a semicolon here, right, with the entire thing kind of written out, this doesn't really make sense now that we've seen how this operator works, right? That's why it was complaining to us before, because now we're saying that the statement ends right here and we don't want to kind of continue, but that doesn't make sense because it's a ternary. So we like, where's the question mark part for this and where's the question for this? Right? Like imagine if you saw this bit of code just laying around by itself, this expression doesn't make sense anymore by itself. Neither really does this one. So that is why you can't have a semicolon between them because the entire expression is kind of one expression. Now, one more thing before we go to the next slide. A lot of people like to have this on one line depending on how big the actual line ends up getting. What you'll see some people do is they'll do something like this, right? Kind of like what I had on the slide. If I actually save my file, it undoes that because it automatically formats it because it's like, oh, this is small enough to put on one line. But sometimes you'll see people do this, and I tend to do this in most of my code unless my editor kind of saves it for me, like you just saw, right? So this is saying the same thing, right? The spacing doesn't actually matter. This is very similar to how you'd have an if and then an else, right? So here's the condition that we're checking. Here's the yes case for the if, and then here's the else case for the no. Okay, so really depends on kind of your team style, your own style, maybe what your preferences are. Which of these two ends up working better for you is really a preference thing. I would say if you have a longer bit of code for the yes and no case, maybe splitting it up on multiple lines is better. If you kind of have very little going on, maybe in one line, it works out better, kind of like this case. All right, so let's take a look at now what we can do with more advanced versions of this ternary operator. So over here, I have a slide that goes over quite a horizontal slide, but let's just focus kind of on this chunk for now, specifically this one to start. We can actually use ternaries with functions as well. And this is where we'll actually see it used a lot. So in this case, what you'll see is that we have a function called happyCheck. That is a function that takes an argument called happy. Okay, and the body of the function is very similar to what we saw earlier with our regular if-else and ternary operator, except instead of actually console logging yay and nope, it's actually returning it, right? So since we're in a function, we can actually return a string to the caller of the function. Okay, so in this case, we're saying if whatever we get from the argument for the function is true, return the string yay, otherwise return the string nope. Okay. What we can do with the ternary operator, and the syntax for this is definitely a bit more confusing. I always seem to mess this up because I put the return in the wrong space, which is why I want to show this to you. We can actually effectively take this code here on the left and turn it into this code here on the right. Okay, so exact same function. It takes one parameter, which we're calling happy. We're going to take that as an argument passed in. If that happy is true, we are going to say return whatever the result kind of this expression is, okay, that I have highlighted. Now, this is where it gets a bit tricky because I really want to kind of emphasize in kind of plain words what's happening here. We have a return statement right away in this function because we want to return a string, right? That's the goal of this function. What we want to do is we want to evaluate this expression, which is a ternary expression, on the right. So JavaScript's going to execute this code first that I have highlighted. We're going to ask the question, is happy true? And then if happy is true, we're going to evaluate to the string yay. And if it's not true, then we're going to evaluate to the string nope. So we're actually going to get yay in the place of this or nope in the place of this. And then we're going to return that string after that evaluation is done evaluating. Or after that statement is done evaluating, I should say. Okay, so it's a bit confusing. So let's take a look at kind of how this works in code. And we can actually even shorten this with some newer syntax as well, which I'll show you as well. So I'll just create kind of a new file here. I'll call this function.js, functions.js. I'll just close this off. I'm going to say const happy check. This is going to be a function. It takes happy as a parameter. And we're going to say if happy is exactly equal to true, then we want to return the string yay, right? Otherwise, we want to return the string nope. Okay, so we can use return because we're inside a function. So this is just declaring the function. It's not actually doing anything. So in order to actually call this code, we need to use kind of the function calling syntax. And we're going to call this and we're going to provide it a value for happy. Okay, and this value that we're going to get, it's kind of spit back out of the function. We can actually grab that if we assign the result of calling this function to a variable. So I'm going to say const result1 is equal to happy check. This is confusing. Definitely check out the functions video where we go over this in detail. I'm going to actually create a second result here. I'm going to say result2 just to compare if we call this with false. Bring back my terminal. I'll run node and functions.js, and I always forget to log these out. So I'm just going to do console.log result1. I'll just put these on the same line just to save some space. What we'll see is the first one's going to evaluate to yay. Second one's going to evaluate to nope. Okay, so when we call happy check with true, we come in here, we get back yay, and we call it with false, we come in here and we get back nope. All right, so let's create another function called happy check2. Nice and creative. This will be the same kind of function. It's going to take happy as an argument. And inside of here, we want to take this code between line 2 and line 6 and see if we can simplify it a little bit. Okay. A lot of the time, if you want to return one thing or another from a function, ternary can be a nice way to simplify the code sometimes. Okay. So we want to return something from this function. And we want to return the expression being evaluated. So the question we want to ask is happy equal to true? I'm going to put this on a separate line. If happy is true, we want to return yay. Otherwise, we want to return nope. Okay. And what you'll see is it actually puts it onto one line for me again, just like our previous example, if I save this with my editor's extensions. But in this case, what we see is we're going to evaluate this expression. Then we're going to either get back a string yay or a string nope. And this is effectively going to turn this into return yay, for example, or it's going to be return nope, right? That's actually what's going to end up happening when we evaluate this expression once we actually give happy a value as an argument. Okay. Now I think I'll say this and it's going to put it all on one line. You can even see on one line, this is pretty simple and pretty concise syntax. So I actually probably would prefer it on one line in this case, because you can actually kind of just read from left to right and it makes a lot of sense. So let's call happy check2 and let's give it true. And let's also give it false. I'll call this const, let's do result 3, running out of variable names. Don't do this to your variable names, it's just for sake of example. Result 4. Console.log, let's do result 3 and result 4. All right, so what we want to see is we want to see basically the same behavior. We want to see yay and nope printed out one more time, and we do, right? So this function between line 4 and 18 for me, technically I don't even need these comments, right? If I really wanted to kind of get rid of those comments, this is a one line of code function, which is pretty spectacular, right? If you compare it to this function right here. Now you could definitely simplify this to be less code, for example, but in that case, you might as well kind of refactor it to, which is changing the code around so that it's a ternary expression with something as simple as this. So hopefully that makes sense. I do want to show you something cool though. There is a new bit of syntax inside JavaScript that actually allows us to shorten this even more. Now this has to do more with functions than it does with the ternary expression, but it's used so much with ternary that I actually want to put it in this video as well. We can take that expression right here, right, our happy check, and we can actually simplify it down to even this. Now what is the difference? If our code as a function in JavaScript, and this only works with modern JavaScript, which these days pretty much is everywhere, we can actually get rid of the brackets around the parameter if there's only one parameter. Okay, if we have more than one parameter, we cannot do this. But if we have one parameter, we can actually get rid of the parentheses. What we can also do as a result is we can get rid of the curly brackets after the arrow. And what that does is that implies that we want to return whatever comes back from the expression after the arrow. And this only works if we have a one-line expression. Okay, now in this case, you can see it's technically 3 lines, but you saw that technically it actually also gets turned into one line. So as long as we have one expression after the arrow, that's actually going to be implicitly returned using this syntax if we don't have the curly brackets. And this is kind of a newer feature of JavaScript that allows us to shorten our code even more. Now, using this sometimes can get a bit hairy. The more that you practice with this code, the easier it'll get. This is definitely used a lot with things like array maps and filters and things like that. And we'll see some examples of that going forward. I just wanted to show you this code side by side, just so you can see kind of what we're removing. For example, these brackets here, these brackets over here, and then also the return, because the return is implicit for whatever this ends up actually evaluating to. So technically what we could do here is I'm just going to create a happy check 3. I'm actually going to copy all this code here. I normally don't copy code, but just to save some time, I'm going to make this happy check 3. This is going to be result 5. This is going to be result 6. And I'm going to change this to happy check 3 here for you as well. And I'm going to change this to result 5 and result 6 as well. What we want to do now is kind of see if we can simplify this. So I'll get rid of the comments. And when I see a function like this, right, I see that this only has one parameter and it's returning something right away, right? We don't have like any code over here, right? We don't have code over here. So we can actually get rid of these parentheses around this happy because it's just one parameter. We can get rid of the curly brackets, and we can also get rid of the return because whatever this statement evaluates to actually gets returned for us automatically. Okay. Now, if I actually run this code, what we should see is the same result, right? We still get back yay and nope, which is quite amazing, right? If you kind of compare the progression from this code to this code and then to just one line of code, that is pretty remarkable. But really understanding what is happening is quite important when it comes to actually this code, because sometimes you can get in the habit of writing code in this way and it might not work as expected. So you can see technically my editor actually put these brackets back in for me when I saved the file. Definitely a bit handy to have them in there, but absolutely not necessary for a statement like this. Okay. So the way to read this again one more time before we go to the next topic is that we have a variable called happycheck3, and since we have an expression on the right that looks like a function, we're going to assign happycheck3 to this function. Okay, this is a arrow function. This arrow function has one parameter, And it's immediately going to return the result of this expression using that parameter as an argument when it gets passed in. So it's going to take happy that gets passed in, for example, either true or false as a concrete value. It's going to run this expression, is it true? If it's true, it's going to return to us the string yay. Otherwise, it's going to return to us the string nope. Okay, so this return keyword is effectively implied kind of like right here. All right, and this only works if we have one parameter and one statement that we want to evaluate inside the function body. Otherwise, we should use this curly bracket syntax over here instead. And if we have more than one parameter, we can kind of have like an X, Y, and Z over here, for example, and then you can see how that would work with multiple arguments. Okay, perfect. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's keep going with this. I want to show you the same kind of concept, but with arrays. So we learned in a previous video how arrays work, but also how the kind of higher order functions like map, filter, and reduce work. Now, one of the most common use cases for ternaries that we'll see is not only for functions, but also for these kind of mapping operations, because technically they also use functions within them. So in this example here on the left, what I have is an array of numbers, 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. And I'm mapping over them. So I'm going to create a new array based on the values in this array, right? I'm going to give it a function, an arrow function in this case, that has one parameter in this case, which is the number once we get passed in as an argument as we're actually looping through this in the map. Our actual function body is going to ask a question, is the number greater than 10? If it is, we're going to return over as a string, which is going to be what gets kind of put in that spot if that thing is greater than 10. So these three values will have over. Otherwise, it's going to return under. So 5 and 10, for example, in this case would have under in their place. So we'll kind of have an array as a result that's under, over, over. All right. What we can do, same with the function that we saw earlier, is we can actually shorten this to this syntax over here, right? We can take the map, provide an arrow function, and then we can return the result of this ternary expression. Very similar to what we just saw, just a function, right? So we can return over or we can return under, depending on what we're mapping over. And you're probably intuiting that I'm actually going to show you the newer syntax as well. And here it is, right? We can actually take out the return. We can even take out the brackets around number and even the curly brackets and actually simplify it even further down to this, right? Where we're asking, is the number greater than 10? If it is, return over implicitly, otherwise return under implicitly. So let's take a look at that as an example. So if I create a new file, I'll call this map.js. What I'll do is I'll just create a const. Let's just call this numbers. And this is going to have 5, 10, 20, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Okay. We can do numbers.map. And now we're going to pass it a function. Okay. So in here, I'm going to say for each number. And over here, I'll use curly brackets to start. I'll actually go with the ternary expression right away and then simplify it to the kind of newer syntax just to save some time, since I think kind of you're hopefully getting the point from the previous functions example. So we want to return the result of the following expression. We're going to ask the question, is the number that we're currently looking at greater than 10? If it is greater than 10, what do we want to do? That's the question. And the answer is we want to return, I think it was over, right? And if it's not greater than 10, well, what we're going to do, we want to return under. So the keyword here is return. Remember with map, if we don't return something, we actually return undefined in a function by default, and that will be in its spot. So I'll show you that in a second as well. I'll actually assign this to a variable. I'll call this const over under, and I'll log over under out. Okay. And you see, as I save my file, it actually shortened this into one line instead of over separate lines, because it actually looks quite nice over one line, according to my extension Prettier. That actually takes my code in VS Code and makes it kind of look better. So I'm going to run node, I'm going to run map, and we can see that we get under, over, right? So 5 and 10 are under, 15, 20, and 25 are over, because we're using greater than and not greater than equal to. Okay. Now, just to really clarify, if I forget to return anything here, what we'll get is undefined for everything, right? Because we return undefined, like kind of in the implicit case like this, if we don't actually return anything ourselves. So don't forget the return. Now we can actually shorten this even further, right? As I mentioned, and we can kind of not even return undefined in this case by accident. If we take away these brackets right here, they'll actually get put back in for me by prettier. But if I kind of get rid of these curly brackets, then I get rid of the return statement. And I also get rid of this semicolon. What will actually end up happening is this will be shortened to that new syntax in JavaScript where I have one parameter and I have the expression that I want to evaluate and then return. Okay. So if I save this, it actually puts it all in one line for me. Really likes to make this nice and concise. But if you actually look at this code, right, it is quite descriptive if you can really understand what's happening. So I'm just going to show you that this actually does the same thing really quick, where we're going to get under, over, right? But the way to read this, right, is we're going to take numbers, we're going to map over numbers, we're going to get back a new array. Give me each number every single loop, and I'm going to ask a question, is the number that we're looking at right now greater than 10? Is it? If it is, then we're going to return over, right? And if it's not, then we're going to return under, right? And that's because we're using this one line, kind of one statement syntax. The return is implicit. So that's pretty beautiful, in my opinion, right? I actually love using this everywhere all the time, right? And kind of going forward, I probably will be using it all the time because this syntax is really amazing. In fact, when I use a language, apart from JavaScript, that actually doesn't have kind of things like map or these nice syntax for kind of more succinct functions like this, I actually kind of like, oh man, I really missed that. And I wish it was in this language, right? Very descriptive once you get a hand for it. But as you can probably imagine, you want to keep these short, concise. Once you start getting too much code in it, you definitely want to use a regular function instead. Okay, so let's keep going with this. Now, some things that can come up as kind of an issue. So I mentioned this earlier at the start of the video, right? But let's take a look at this. If we have an if-else statement that does multiple things, right? So in this case, for example, if we have const happy equals true, we're asking the question, is happy true? And you can see that the body for this if statement, right, actually has two expressions in it. It has console log yay and then console log smiley face, right? And if it's false, we actually have two expressions as well. We have console log nope and then console log sad face, right? So what happens with a ternary operator is that we can't really do this. It's technically possible, but it's a really kind of janky solution. And I highly advise you not to use a ternary expression or operator in cases like this, where you have kind of more than one thing happening in the yes case and more than one thing happening in the no case. Only really use ternary operators in the cases where it's just one thing and one thing for both the if and the else respectively. Okay, so what's going to happen here is if you look at this code, since we have a semicolon here at the end of our kind of question mark and then console log yay, this expression ends right here. It's going to end. Then we're going to have these expressions kind of get evaluated after, but which doesn't make sense, right? Because not only is our ternary not completed without the colon, right? But this kind of colon just hanging out by itself over here also doesn't really make sense, right? So this code is not going to run. This is actually going to be a syntax error, right? So just be aware of that. I think the general rule of thumb, right, to keep in mind is that if you have more than one thing happening in the if case, just use a regular if else block, right? Same thing with the else case. We use a regular if else block. Right? Use ternaries only in cases where you have something that's happening like this, where you have one thing happening in the yes case, one thing happening in the no case. Okay, so I think that makes sense. I don't think it needs further explanations because we also saw this earlier in the video. Now, one thing I do also want to show you before we kind of finish this off is this idea of a nested ternary statement. Now, again, this I highly recommend you do not do. Okay, I am not going to do this and I recommend you not do this, but you will see this happen in code. And just so you're aware of what's happening and the logic behind it, I want to include it here for you. Now, with an if statement, this definitely makes sense. And you will see this happen a lot. In fact, we can even simplify this if statement using our conditional operators within this syntax here. But for sake of example, let's take a look at this kind of series of statements on the left-hand side. We have happy, which is true, salty, which is true, right? Then if we focus on this if statement right here, we're saying if happy is true, then also check if salty is true. If salty is true, we're just going to print out really. Otherwise, we're going to print out yay. So really is going to print out if both happy and salty are true. Otherwise, yay is going to print out if happy is true, but salty is false. And if happy is not true, so if happy is false, then we're just going to print out nope. Okay, so the nested kind of operator is happening here. This is the nested expression. Salty is going to be checked only in the case that happy is true. Okay, and it's going to do different things depending on what salty's value is, only in the case where happy is true. Now, it is possible to turn this into a ternary operator. And again, I highly, highly recommend you do not do this, but let's just go through it for sake of example. We have happy and salty over here, right? I think I forgot to put const here. So I'll just put that. And we're asking the question here. So these hopefully line up operator-wise. So this darker green and lighter green, and the lighter orange and the dark orange. So we're first going to ask if happy is true, question mark, right? So in the case that happy is true, we are not done yet because we still need to know if salty is true, right? So we're then also going to ask another nested ternary operator inside of the first one. We're going to ask is salty true, question mark, right? And if it is, then we're going to console log really. And if it's not, then we're going to console log yay. And then we're going to kind of exit this ternary expression and go out to this console log out here, the nope, in the case that happy is false. Now, if you're looking at this and being like, oh my goodness, like what is this? Like what is happening, right? I agree with you, right? I would be really sad, right? I would definitely end up in this nope case if I saw this ternary expression. Now, this is actually one of the more simpler ones that you might see. There are way more complicated expressions that people like to shove into ternary operators, especially as they first start learning them. However, I really, really implore you, just be as explicit as possible. And if you see code like this, maybe it's easier just to turn it into a regular if-else statement. Now, this comes back down to a few other tips, which we'll see in the project videos as we get to them coming up. But really the purpose of code is to make things more readable for us. Right? If you look at this code, you can definitely say, at least most people would probably say, that this is pretty readable once you know what the syntax is doing. Right? At the start, yes, very confusing, for sure. That's a lot going on in a short amount of lines of code. In this case, only one line, right? But once you actually know what's going on, this is actually quite beautiful and quite elegant, and this makes sense. You can kind of read through this and understand what's happening, just as I did earlier. However, I would probably not say the same for this. Okay, especially if you think of this in the context of just a whole bunch of other code before and after it. Maybe it's inside an if-else statement or something like that, or a loop, right? This is just really, really confusing, right? I would implore you to only use ternary operators in a very simple case where you just want to check one thing and then return one thing or another, or do one thing or another, depending on what that value ends up being, truthy or falsy. Right? Nesting them, definitely I would say a no-no, right? In pretty much every case, even a simple case as this. So hopefully I've hammered that home enough. I'm actually not going to show an example of this because I do not want us to go down this path, just for sake of example, so you actually know what's up with nested operators for ternary statements. Now, what we'll do is I've created a bunch of exercises for the ternary operator as well. So I'm excited to get to that in the next video. And if you enjoyed this video and you found these examples useful, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. As well, I'd love to hear in the comments. Do you like using the ternary operator? Do you see people kind of using it like this, right? Have you ever messed it up and kind of ended up with bugs in your code, or kind of weird things happen? Or do you just kind of like to use just a regular if-else statement and you're more than happy to do that and not use any of this syntax? And also maybe like, what do you feel about kind of the mapping and filtering and things like that? Do you prefer one style over the other style for that? And is it maybe different from any other code that you use that's outside of a map or filter, for example, right? I'd love to hear what you think about those questions. Now, that said, I'll see you in the exercise videos where we can get into more practice together. See you later.